Romans chapter 4 and verse 15. Because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Let's talk about the law worketh wrath for a minute. Have you ever had a conversation with someone about the gospel and they'll say, I keep the Old Testament law? Well, you don't. And we'll talk about that more in a minute. But what does the law produce? It worketh wrath. If you're trying to keep the law, what you're doing is you are working wrath. You are generating wrath that someone has to pay for because you don't keep the law adequately. Now notice what the second part of the verse says. For where no law is, there is no transgression. So what the law actually does is it creates more wrath. How does it create more wrath? Well, when there's no law, what is there none of? There's no transgression. So let me explain that. Look with me at 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. Whosoever committeth sin transgresseth also the law, for sin is the transgression of the law. So you see a definition of sin there. What is sin? It's the transgression of the law. In Scripture, the term law does not solely refer to the Old Testament law given to Moses. The term law can refer to any instruction, any knowledge of right and wrong that God gives. So let me give you this as an example. God gave a law, an instruction to Adam and Eve. What was that instruction? Not to eat from the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. So let's look at two verses together. Genesis chapter 2, verse 17. Genesis chapter 2, 17. And 1 Timothy 2, 14. So Genesis 2, 17 and 1 Timothy 2, 14. Let's read Genesis 2, 17 first. But of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die. So Genesis 2:17 is obviously an instruction. It's a law given by God to Adam and Eve, telling them, don't do this. Look with me at 1 Timothy 2:14. 1 Timothy 2:14. And Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived, notice what it says, was in the transgression. Why was the woman in the transgression? Because God gave an instruction, don't do this. When you do this, you transgress the law. Sin is transgression of the law. It's disobedience to a commandment that God has given. Now, think with me, go back to Romans 4:15 just for a minute. It says, because the law worketh wrath, for where no law is, there is no transgression. Isn't that interesting? What the latter part of that verse is saying is where there is no law, there is no transgression. Look with me at Romans 5:13. Romans chapter 5 and verse 13. For until the law, sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed when there is no law. So when no law exists, sin is not imputed. But does sin exist even if it's not imputed? And the answer is yes, it does. What God does is He does not impute sin when there is no law, because the sinner doesn't have awareness of his sin. So I'm going to give you an example of this. You ready? There's two toddlers, and they're sitting next to each other, and they're playing with their own toy cars. And one of the toddlers looks over and he sees the dog, and he says, I don't want to play with the toy car. I'm going to play with the dog. So he leaves the toy car. And the other toddler says, aha, I see another toy car, and that one has my name on it. And so the other toddler grabs that toy car, and he picks it up and he starts playing with it. Now, the toddler who does that, who picks up the car, does he have an understanding of property rights and ownership and criminal law and any of those things? He doesn't have any of that understanding. He just sees a car and says, well, that looks interesting. I'm going to play with that. But my point is, at least yet, we wouldn't prosecute toddlers for stuff like that because it would be stupid. Because the toddler has no awareness that he's committing a crime and so on. Now, is it a sin? Yes, it's a sin. But sin is not imputed when there is no law, when there's no understanding that the person is transgressing a law, transgressing a commandment. Look with me at Hosea chapter 8 and verse 1. Look with me at Hosea chapter 8 and verse 1. When you're trying to understand Bible terms, it is often a good idea to look at how the same word is used elsewhere. Look with me at Hosea 8 verse 1, and we're going to get a definition of what transgression is. Hosea 8:1. Set the trumpet to thy mouth. He shall come as an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant, notice, and trespassed against my law. So in that verse, transgression or transgressed, what is it equated with? Trespass. You see that? Because they have transgressed my covenant and trespassed against my law. So what transgression is it's trespass. So I want to give you another example just to make the point. Let's say that I own 40 acres of forest property, and let's say that the boundaries are not clearly marked. So I'm out in the back 40 and I'm wandering around, and I wander onto my neighbor's property, but I don't know it because the boundaries aren't marked. Now, I've trespassed in the sense that I've gone beyond where I should have gone. It wouldn't be criminal trespass in that I didn't have the intent to do it. I was just wandering around and didn't realize where I was. Well, that's very similar to the way that the law operates. What the law does is it tells you where the boundaries are. And when the law tells you where the boundaries are and you violate the boundary, now you've trespassed or you've committed transgression. So hopefully this is all clear then. So what happens? Is there sin in the world even without the law? Yes, there clearly is. Do toddlers sin? Yes, they do. But when you come to the point where you have the knowledge of the law, where you have awareness of the boundaries, then when you violate those boundaries, you've engaged in transgression or trespass. Okay? Now get with me Deuteronomy chapter 22. And we'll start in verse 8. Deuteronomy chapter 22, and we'll start in verse 8. And I want to dig just a little further on the idea that people think they're saved by keeping the Old Testament law. I've had the experience of talking to folks where if you ask the question, if you were to die and God were to say, why should I let you into my heaven, what would you say? And one of the things that people come back with is they'll say, well, I keep the 10 Commandments. And they think they keep the 10 Commandments because they haven't committed murder, right? Because they've certainly coveted, and they've certainly borne false witness. Can anyone raise their hand and say, during my time on earth, I've never lied? I mean, would anyone have the audacity to do that? But what people think is they haven't committed murder, or they haven't, committed idolatry, and so therefore they're okay. Look with me at Deuteronomy 22, verse 8. When thou buildest a new house, then thou shalt make a battlement for thy roof, that thou bring not blood upon thine house, if any man fall from thence. I'm guessing no one in this congregation has a battlement on their house. You probably don't. Does anyone? Some of you don't even know what a battlement is, right? I don't have a battlement on my house. Is roofing dangerous work today? Roofing is dangerous work because roofs typically are slanted, and there are very few houses that have battlements. Now, what's my point? If you think you're keeping the Old Testament law because you didn't commit murder, you don't have any understanding of what the Old Testament law says. You haven't even bothered to read it. Look at verse 11. Thou shalt not wear a garment of diverse sorts, as of woolen and linen together. What that means, if you own any garment where you look at the tag and it doesn't say 100%, you're violating the Old Testament law. Isn't what happens with most modern garments that it's a blend of different threads to obtain the desired structural qualities? Well, you're violating the Old Testament law just by wearing a t-shirt. Verse 12. How many of you do this? Thou shalt make thee fringes upon the four quarters of thy vesture, wherewith thou coverest thyself. How many of you do that? These are just three of the simplest things. When Romans 4 talks about the law worketh wrath, you know what the law does? The law doesn't give you 10 commandments. It gives you hundreds and hundreds of commandments that if you ever bothered to read, you would never say, yeah, did that one too? Did that one? Oh yeah, I'm good at that one. No, you would read things and you would realize, I've never even considered this. I violate this on a daily basis. I have to sell my house and get rid of all my clothes. Right? If you're actually trying to keep the law, that's what you'd have to do.